My name is Jeff Whitmire. I want to thank many of you. Some of you I know, some of you is the night's first time I've met you. And as was mentioned earlier, our church, Restoring Faith Church, is hosting this tonight. I pastor the church here that meets on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Michael helps me, and sometimes Joel, my son, steps in when I'm traveling. We're not having church this Sunday because all the families are going to be gone, so we're headed down to Panama City Beach. I guess we picked the wrong time to go on vacation, but it is what it is. But you know, one of the things I wanted to share with you guys, just to give you a little bit of information, most of you probably realize that Cherokee County is one of the most conservative counties in the nation. The district is one of the most conservative districts in the nation. But you may not be aware, I've spent 18 to 20 years of my life, either myself or one of my older sons, which are not here, they've gotten married and that kind of stuff now, have been the precinct captain for Union Hill. This precinct is one of the top 5 or 10 most conservative precincts in one of the most conservative counties and one of the most conservative districts in the nation. And the turnout, and the thing there, over the years, looking at the numbers, there's been many times that this precinct, along with 2 others, has been the deciding factor on some major victories in the primaries. So I want to thank you guys all for that hard work. I don't do that anymore. I've retired from the Republican Party, so to speak, from that standpoint. But it's really interesting. With that said, I want to introduce a very dear friend of mine. Barry and his wife Desiree are here, and Christiana and her husband Max here. Christiana is his favorite daughter. And so she's always here. And just took that from you there. But Barry's going to share a lot of things with you. I won't be here after a while. Michael will close us out later. I've got to drive to Winston-Salem tonight for some meetings in the morning that got pulled on me at the last minute. And then I get to fly to New York City and I don't know, I'll take a shower when I get home. But anyway, Barry, thank you for everything you do. And here's Barry.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for helping put this on. This is something that we've done regularly when I first ran for Congress, even before I was in Congress, when I was serving in State House and State Senate. Just opportunity to get together. We found out that doing things like this, more intimate settings, are much more productive than the town halls that people tend to be pretty popular. But it's just an opportunity for us to get together, because I fully believe that if you're going to represent folks in Washington, D.C., you gotta have one-on-one time with people. And so the way we do these is I just spend just a little bit telling you about me, and then I think we'll open it up for questions if anybody has any questions. If you hadn't figured it out, I'm not in charge of this. My daughter is, and she is my favorite daughter. She's my only daughter. So I can clarify that. We're not choosing favorites in our family, but my 2 sons would probably argue about who is the favorite. But look, just a little bit about myself. I know several people in the room here today, but I'm originally from Georgia. I grew up in a town called Riverdale, which when I grew up there, it was a long way from Atlanta. And now it's just part of metropolitan Atlanta. I left there after I graduated high school. I just went to Alaska for the summer. I was just going to work construction. My dad and I went up there to work construction. The construction industry was not doing too well here. And it was a bad economy. And I'm sure Don can remember those times in the late 70s, early 80s. It was really a struggle. But my dad was of the generation that believed, as he taught me to believe, is if there isn't work where you are, don't rely on someone else to carry your load. Go to where the work is. Find work. He found work in Alaska. I had several offers to go play college football, so my idea was, hey, my dad went to Alaska. My mom will probably go up there with him. I get to stay in Georgia, and I'll go to college, and I'll have the summer at home alone. And so my dad my dad knew me. I didn't know he knew me that well, but he gave me a graduation present. It was a one-way ticket to Alaska. And so I went there to work construction just for the summer. My intention to come back, go to one of the colleges and play football, but two things happened that changed my life. It changed my course of life. The first thing that happened was I really found the value of hard work, free enterprise, supply and demand economics, because there was a lot of construction work available and there wasn't that many laborers available. So when there's more jobs available than our laborers, guess what? You get paid pretty well. And I was 17 years old, making $15 an hour in 1981, working as many hours as I could physically work. And when you're 17 years old, you can work a lot of hours. When you're also 17 years old and you're working sometimes 80 hours a week, guess what? You don't have time to spend any of that money. So I learned the value of hard work, and I started thinking, well, maybe I'll stay up here and continue to work for a while. But the other thing that really caused me to not come back to Georgia was I started volunteering at our church doing a ministry into low-income areas of Anchorage, Alaska. And on Saturdays, we would go literally knock on doors, which I think was probably training for running for office someday. But we would literally go knock on doors and just invite families to come to church the next day. We would bring a bus into the neighborhood and we would take them to church. And so I was volunteering doing that on every weekend. Well, I got teamed up with a young lady who had moved up there from Nashville, Tennessee. Long story short, February will be our 36th wedding anniversary, and so that was the real reason that it changed my life, because I took a different direction. I think God was leading us in that direction. Now, people ask me, you've been in politics for some time. I spent 6 years at the State House, I spent 3 years in the State Senate, and now I'm just completing my 4th year in Congress. They say you must like politics. Truth is, I hate politics. I really do. If you think about it, poly is many and ticks are blood-sucking parasites, right? It explains some of the things we have to deal with, some of the people you work with. But in reality, the reason I got involved in government is because I love this country. I didn't like some of the things that was happening to the country, the direction that the country was going. I didn't like the direction our state was going. And my dad gave me a lot of advice growing up, but one piece of advice which has really been a beacon for me, guiding me, is this. He said, if there's something in life you don't like, you have two choices. You can do something to change the situation, or you can accept the status quo and just go on with your life. But complaining never accomplishes anything. And that was really what drove me to get into the political arena, is I want my children, and especially my grandchildren, to have a better America than I had growing up. And the direction we were going was not taking us in that direction. And so that's really what has driven me. Now, what drives me now, and my basic philosophy is really the same philosophy of our founding fathers, is I trust you more than I trust a government bureaucracy to make a decision of what's best for your life. I trust you to do more with your money than I do the federal government and the IRS to allow you to invest what's important to you and your family. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe that, as Thomas Paine put it, one of our founders, that government is a necessary evil. In its best state, it's a necessary evil. In its worst state, it's an intolerable one. What he meant was exactly what we're saying. People have been given freedom. They've been given rights. And government should be limited just to that point to protect the freedom of the individuals. That's been what the strength of America has been throughout our generations, is that freedom, that liberty. When you look at when America was the strongest, when America was at its peak, when America was at its greatest, when our economy was the one, there's always been a leading economy, but the one that went from basically nothing to the leading economy in the entire world. We went from a ragtag rabble during the American Revolution to quickly emerge to the most powerful nation in the history of the world. What got us there? It wasn't big government. It was people with the freedom to achieve their life's ambitions with a government that just put barriers to keep them, as they achieved, from violating the rights of somebody else or their ability to achieve. Our nation hasn't been perfect, but it does have the capacity to grow and to change. What happens when you bring government, a big monstrosity of government into the picture, is then the more government, the less freedom. It's been quoted by many of our founders as the government that governs least governs best. The best, I love telling stories, and I'll share with you this story and I guess we'll turn it over. The best monument to freedom and to individual liberty and what can be accomplished is in Washington, D.C. And it's right down the road from the Capitol. It's in the Air and Space Museum. And it's just a conglomeration of pipes, wood, and canvas. I mean, I'm an aviator. Don's a pilot. I'm a pilot. I love aviation. It's one of my favorite museums. That and the Bible Museum and the American History Museum. I could spend hours in each one of them. But when you think about what's in the Air and Space Museum, there's Apollo capsules, there's Navy jets, there is technology just unbelievable from across the world. But the most impressive to me is on the second floor, and it's the Wright Flyer. That little conglomeration of pipes and wood that transformed the world. And people say, why is that so impressive to you? Because I want you to think not only of the achievement, but who achieved it. You see, Orville and Wilbur Wright were not scientists and engineers. They were bicycle mechanics. But they achieved for what for centuries scientists and engineers couldn't achieve. Think about this. I mean, we go back, Leonardo da Vinci was trying to develop flying machines. But scientists and engineers could not accomplish what two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio were able to accomplish. And what was the difference? It was freedom. See, Orville and Wilbur were not constrained by flawed models and theories that had never been questioned. They didn't have science degrees, they had library cards. They did the research. They challenged the status quo. And they were able to achieve something, the greatest technological achievement in the history of mankind. Not only did they have the freedom to succeed, they had the freedom to fail. Seems like in modern America, we deem failure as a bad thing. Thomas Edison said, I did not fail 1,000 times to create a light bulb. I proved 1,000 ways not to make one. See, failure is a part of success. So they had the freedom to fail. You know, the Wright brothers crashed more than they flew. In fact, I asked the docent who was giving us a tour one day, I said, how much of the Wright Flyer is still original? He said, well, it depends on what you consider original. From that day at Kitty Hawk, very little, because they crashed even more after that. Well, he said a lot of the parts, he went through the parts that were still original. He said, but the canvas is not. The canvas is long gone, deteriorated. So I asked him, I said, is there any part of that original canvas left? He said, yes. And he walked me over to the wall right by the door, and there's a plaque hanging on the wall. And in the plaque is a little piece of cloth. And he said, that is the only piece that we know of remaining of Orville and Wilbur's Wright Flyer. And that piece of cloth was in the pocket of Neil Armstrong when he stepped foot on the moon. Now here's the other amazing thing, the testament to what freedom can do. You know, it was only 69 years from when Orville and Wilbur flew until we landed on the moon. Only 69 years. Why? NASA didn't get us to the moon. NASA was a management agency. Who got us to the moon was the engineers at Lockheed, at Grumman, at all of the contractors who the government said, you guys innovate. You guys have the freedom to come up with new ideas, to move forward, not to be constrained by status quo. That's what got us to the moon. Now I want you to contrast that with something I've been working on since I've been in Congress. Just until a few weeks ago, I was on the Space Science and Technology Committee. In fact, it's my first year in Congress. They made me a subcommittee chair, and I really didn't know what I was doing there, but it was because of my background in technology. But I take my jobs very seriously, and I started looking at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I started asking questions. Why are we behind on our weather satellites? We were woefully behind. In fact, if you notice most of the, if you watch Weather Channel or any of the newscasts, what data are they using? European data. Why? Because we are way behind in launching the next generation of weather satellites. We've led the world in this. I wanted to know why, so I started researching it. Well, it's because the government figured out, you know what? We know better than everybody else. So NOAA decided, instead of contracting out the design of the next generation of weather satellites, they were going to do it themselves. What they designed couldn't be launched because it was too heavy. It was too big. It physically would not work. So they went back to the drawing board and tried to do it again, and tried to do it again, to the point that we launched our backup satellite when one of our weather satellites failed. We now have no backup weather satellites, and we're finally have gotten NOAA to go to the contractors and let them do what they do. So I believe when the American people are given the freedom to innovate, to keep more of their own money, to do what you see happening every time there's a natural disaster now, who's the first to respond? We are. The churches. When tornadoes hit Cartersville, Georgia, you know FEMA came in. Oh, actually it was in Adairsville. FEMA came in, turned around and left. They said, you don't need us. We're going to go somewhere else. Why? Because neighbors were helping neighbors. When we remove the constraints of government, and I'm not advocating no government, we need government. But most of our government right now, do you know that there's one federal employee for every 76 citizens? One federal employee for every 76 citizens. When the Department of Agriculture was created in the Lincoln administration, there was one bureaucrat for every 250,000 farmers. Today we have one bureaucrat for every 8. You would think you would be able to do more with less in modern technology. We've seen a rapid growth in government beyond anything that we can sustain in this nation. And so I'm not against government. We need government. But it needs to be limited, and government needs to be the most effective, which is closest to the people. That's why I think Wes's job should be a whole lot more harder than mine. But what we've done is taken a lot of the authority from the states and taken it to the federal level, which is further displaced from the people. The direction we've been going and I've been pushing is to reverse that trend. Wes is going to be a whole lot more responsive to you and your individual needs than I ever could be. Why? Because you have, what, about 70,000 constituents? 55,000, I have 750,000. So he and your county commissioners, your school board members, speaking of commissioners, Harry Johnson was, thank you for coming. They're going to be more responsive to your needs, and they should be empowered, not constrained by federal bureaucracy. That's really the philosophy that I hate to use the term governed, but that has led me in every vote I make and every piece of legislation I've introduced and moved forward. So enough about me. I see Max standing up here like he needs to come and take the mic for a moment. So.
Well, thank y'all so much for coming out. We're really excited that y'all are here and could share with Congressman Loudermilk. Now we're just going to move into a 15-minute question and answer time, and then Congressman Loudermilk will stick around, and if you want to come meet him or shake his hand or take a picture or ask him any other questions that we don't get to cover in this. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for doing this.
Yes.
I have been very active in politics ever since from the greatest school. I agree with everything you said, but I have some questions and I have a lot of concerns.
Okay.
A lot of concerns. As to where we're going, how this country, the direction that it's going, and what's going on up in Washington, D.C. So If you don't mind, I'll just start with one and lead to a few others. Recently, in one of your emails, you asked, you said, you know, if you have any, it said, if you have any questions for Larry, you will respond. I had a very important question, and somehow it got lost through the cracks. So I'm going to ask you that question that I have. And that question is Social Security. Does Congress use the Social Security Fund for other things than Social Security?
Well, first of all, and I'll answer that, let me address, if the questions, if you were responding to where we recently sent out questions, we had over 500 questions come in, and we're responding. In fact, I'm going to be recording the first responses, and they're going to go out in our newsletter. We were surprised with how many questions came in, and so we are responding to all of those in proper format. If you remember back during the Clinton time frame, there was a lot of discussion about a lockbox. I don't know if you remember that. It was, we're going to put Social Security in a lockbox. Social Security is in a different budget category, which I have a constitutional issue with it, but when you talk about the appropriations process in Congress, there's two separate budgets. There's the discretionary budget, then there's what's called the mandatory budget. The mandatory budget is automatically, the revenues are automatically taken in, they're automatically spent without any input from Congress whatsoever. It's by law. That's what I have a constitutional issue with, because the Constitution says the legislative branch basically has the entire power of the purse for all federal spending. And what previous legislatures has done is said, well, this is such a politically driven issue, Social Security, which in my opinion, Social Security should be a state issue, not a federal, because of these types of reasons. The answer is Congress does not have the ability legally to spend any Social Security money, because it automatically goes to Social Security. It is automatically spent. So when we're appropriating, none of that is touched. So if that makes sense, it's actually in its lockbox over here, which is creating some trouble, because when we start talking about national debt, and we're talking about $21 trillion of national debt, that's just on the discretionary side. When you look over on the mandatory side, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and some other government subsidy programs that are on this automatic tax and spend area, we're talking, in 10 years it could be nearly $100 trillion in debt because of how things are changing. It's going to have to be addressed at some point, but to answer your question, we do not have a legal facility to spend that money, because it's totally separate. When we're doing budgeting, all of the budgeting is basically out of, when you look at your paycheck, there's money taken out for Social Security, then there's federal income tax withheld. The reason it's separated is because all that Social Security money goes over there. It doesn't go into the pot that Congress spends.
You had a majority in the House and the Senate at one time of Republicans, and there was a little talk. Usually this talk happens a lot when congressmen are campaigning, because we all are very concerned about the overspending in the budget. And so everybody says, yeah, well, when I go to Washington, I'm going to do this, that, but it never gets done. And that is an amendment to the Constitution that we have to balance our budget. Because if we're going to go up to those trillions, what did you say?
It's 21 trillion right now.
21 trillion. Yeah. Our foreign policy is going to be hurt, and our negotiating powers with our trade and with the rest of the world will be compromised, especially China.
Right.
And so it is not only, it's very, very important that somebody takes the leadership up there. You know, it happens every time.
You're looking at it.
Yeah, let me answer that real quick, and then if you don't mind, we'll take a couple others, and then you and I can get together afterwards. I just want to make sure others have an opportunity, and if we have some time remaining, we can come back. You're absolutely right. We don't have to have a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, but we need one. Let me say have to, because we have in the past done it without a constitutional amendment, but you do not have enough people in Congress with the willingness to do the tough decisions that it takes to balance the budget. You can't balance it overnight because of the irresponsibility of previous Congresses. Now, I introduced my first year in Congress, and 2 years ago, I introduced a balanced budget amendment that I spent a lot of time working on. When I first got to Congress, I noticed that when the Republicans passed their budget, the budget actually balanced within a 10-year window, which is really what it's going to take to get there. Because of the deficits and the debts, you've got to project going forward. For instance, if you have a mortgage on your house and you want to pay your house off, very few people have enough money in the bank just to write a check to pay the house off, right? So you double your payments going forward and maybe pay it off in 15 years instead of 30 years. We have to do the same thing because of the irresponsibility of previous Congresses. The problem is the political will to do it. It's not there anymore. The last time we balanced a budget was about 40 years ago. I mean, well, actually, I think in Newt Gingrich's time, which I think there was a time that about the budget balance. When we passed the budget that balanced within 10 years, I was encouraged. Then the next year I was in Congress, we passed a budget that balanced within 10 years. Well, that should have been 9 years. Last year we passed a budget that balanced within 10 years. That should have been 8 years, right? The problem is, I went back and looked, Congress for many years has been passing budgets that balance within 10 years, but it's a sliding window, and we never get any closer. My balanced budget amendment basically said Congress must, within 10 years of ratification of the amendment, Congress can only spend the equivalent of the revenue that it brings in, or a percentage of the GDP. And so that basically would close that window down, because we can get there in 10 years. We can close that deficit gap within 10 years. We have to. Now, we've started working on a plan. Now, we actually brought a balanced budget amendment up on the House floor this year. The problem is it takes a supermajority. It takes 2/3 of the House to pass it. It only got Republican votes when it came to the floor. And so we've been unable to get the votes to get there. It's going to take a significant change. I think the Article 5 movement that's going on right now is going to get us. I was hoping that it would get so close that it would prompt Congress to actually take action. I don't know that that's going to happen. We'll see what happens in this election cycle. But just to give you an idea how quickly we have to move on this, to let you know how much debt we have, $21 trillion. Most people don't even understand how much that is. Let me see if I can put it in perspective you may understand. If you know what today's date is, you know when Jesus was born, okay? Regardless of your religious background, our calendar system, modern calendar system, is based on the birth of Christ. So if you know what today's date is, it gives you an idea of when Jesus was born. So if you were to go back to the moment Jesus was born and deposit $17,000 in the First Bank of Bethlehem, and you wait 60 seconds and you deposit another $17,000. You wait another 60 seconds and you deposit another $17,000. And every minute you deposit $17,000 to today, you still wouldn't have enough to pay off the national debt. That's $17,000 every minute since Jesus was born. Now, the only way that we can pay that debt off, number one, is to get the economy going. It would be impossible to close the deficit gap. We could not tax every dime made by businesses or individuals in this country and pay off the debt. It was impossible to do that. We had to get the economy going. We've done that. we've started getting the economy going. In fact, government revenues are already rising. A lot of people don't realize this, but there was a lot of talk about what the cost of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was really going to be. Well, it did increase the deficits a little bit, but we've already brought in 1/3 of the cost in increased revenues already. And so we're seeing the result of that, paying it forward, bringing in more revenues. You have to get the economy rolling to be able to pay off the debt. But the next phase is we have to have fiscal responsibility in Washington to not spend everything that comes in, but roll it into the deficit. The only way that I know that we're going to do that is through a balanced budget amendment. And so, yes, sir.
Okay. Two real quick ones. One is the choice legislation for the VA.
Yeah.
I understand that's passed.
Mhm.
When is that going to go into effect? And number two, probably one of the most important votes you're going to make coming up is for Speaker of the House.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you like?
I like them all. In fact, I'm friends with the only two that I know are running, which is Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan. I'm good friends with both of them. I'll answer that one first. We're not even going to have that discussion until we know who has the majority, because if the Republicans don't have the majority, it doesn't matter who's running, right? And there'll probably be others actually get into the race. Jim actually sent me a letter. I talk to Jim all the time on the House floor, him and Kevin. But Jim sent a letter to me and some of the other conservatives that are close to him, and basically said, yes, I'm going to run for the Speaker of the House, but I'm not running now. Basically saying we're not going to have this conversation until after the November election. So just so you know, I am running, but I'm not campaigning, because we have to focus, as a team, because those things can be divisive. Boy, as I found out, half the world never realized that there were multiple rounds of voting for the Speaker. In the first round, when I was first there in Congress, I voted against John Boehner, but he became the nominee. So I went to the House floor, I voted for him, because that was the process you go through, right? It'd be like Trump being our nominee and he goes to the National Convention and we bring somebody else out. That's wrong, And so we've learned that those can be very divisive, so we're going to wait until after that. And your first question was? Yeah, VA choice. Let me check it to see when it goes into effect. A lot of the bills that we pass will go into effect at the beginning of 2019. But we can get the answer on that. We've done a tremendous amount of reforming the VA. I'm a veteran as well, but I work very closely with Phil Rowe, who is the chairman of the Veterans Committee in the House. And we're starting to actually see some of the reforms taking place now, just from some of the legislation we passed. The VA Reform and Accountability Act was a crucial piece to that. And so it's encouraging the direction we're going. We're not there yet, but we'll get that answer to you, for you.
We have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take yours and one more.
And yeah, you talked about the percentage of people in the ag department,
Right.
1 to 200, whatever it is. And part of the VA, the ability, Trump always talks about we get rid of the debt. Well, anybody that's worked for government, we know we got a lot of debt.
Absolutely.
In years past, we talked about, why do we have a department, a federal Department of Education?
Right.
We got a city department, a county department, a state department. I'd love to hear some talk about shrinking these gigantic bureaucracies, but yet the civil service, as you know.
Did you tell him to ask this question? I've got a great answer for you. Tune in when we get back. I've been working on this issue since I first got into Congress. When I was in the military, I was taught you can't fix a problem by putting Band-Aids on it. You got to get to the root of the problem. Like, you go to the doctor with a headache and he just keeps giving you aspirin for the headache. You never get anywhere until you figure out what's causing the headaches, right? So I wanted to know what is causing a continual growth in the federal government. Also, why is the federal government rated very last in customer satisfaction? It's like light years between who's next to last in the federal government. Well, the problem is most of our regulatory, or not just regulatory agencies, but government agencies have lost scope of what they're there for. 80% of Americans do not believe that the government works in their interest. Now, when you look at 80% of Americans, that's bipartisan, right? They don't trust the government. They don't think government employees work in their best interest. And the reason is because of the culture within the agencies. Most of these agencies are driven by their policy, not driven by the customers they're supposed to be serving. This is what they forget. They work for you. You're a nuisance to them. I mean, and I'm painting with a broad brush, and it's not every federal employee. We got a lot of good federal employees out there, but they're overshadowed by those bad ones. I was on the Homeland Security Committee in the first Congress, and we're looking over their budgets, and all of a sudden I find this strange line item number of $380 million. So I ask, what's this $380 million for? And they've said, well, that's money we pay employees to stay at home and not come to work. Okay, somebody who owned a business, I'm like, okay, what? You're spending my tax dollars to tell somebody to stay at home and not come to work? They said, yeah, there's $380 million. I was like, why? Well, they lost their security clearance because of disciplinary actions. Why are they still employed? Because it takes about 360 days to get them off the payroll. Because the civil service laws have to be reformed. But also, if you want to appeal your firing, you can stretch it out another year. So they have people in Homeland Security that we've paid full pay and benefits for 2 years to never come to work. Another quick antidote on this is, imagine wherever you work, if an employee came in at night and was stealing the computer systems and selling them at a pawn shop. Didn't get caught until he decided to steal the video cameras, not thinking there's something recording him. He sold them on eBay. Okay? If that happened in any of your places of business, they would have left in handcuffs, ended up in jail, and been prosecuted. But not if you work for the EPA. It's a true story. 2 weeks without pay, had to stay at home, back at the EPA working again. Never prosecuted. All he had to do is pay for the value of the computers, their depreciated value. Why? Because it's too hard to get rid of somebody. The default of most managers in the federal government, if you've got a bad employee, is to promote them. That's the easiest way to get rid of a bad employee. So you think about, okay, it's called merit. Modern Employment Reform, Improvement, and Transformation Act of 2018. No, 2017, it's now 18, but that's the bill that we ended up coming up with to fix this problem. If you listen to the President's State of the Union address, he came out and mentioned it, not by name, but he said, I want on my desk this year a bill that will allow me to get rid of those bad federal employees. Why? Because the good federal employees are having to pick up the slack, and they're making it bad for everybody else. And the problem is the culture never changes. When you look at what's going on in a lot of these agencies, Tom Price, good friend of mine, Tom was run out by career bureaucrats who didn't like his management style, and they know that you can't get rid of them. You're seeing that in agencies all over. There's actually government the White House polled the government agencies, and 2/3 of the employees are in support of this. All the Merit Act does is it reforms the Civil Service Code by saying, if you have poor performance as a federal employee, and it's documented, 15 days and you're out the door. Your appeal, you can appeal 15 days in the appeal. That's basically what everybody else in America has to do. We polled it ourselves. We polled, simple question, should federal workers be held to the same standards as every other American employee? 95% of the people said yes. This is a partisan issue now, but it shouldn't be, because Americans across the board are saying, look, we just need to have accountability in our government. And that's really what is lacking. And so the good news is we were actually got the bill is out of committee, and it is queued to come up on the House floor within a week or two after the elections when we get back to Washington. The President, we've been working with the White House on this. They want to get it into the Senate and try to get it out of the Senate before the end of the year to get it on his desk. That'll be a little more challenge than the House, but we're that close. So.
I got one more question. They introduced the Senate version of the Merit Act as well.
When are we going to wake up and limit the terms that congressmen and senators have?
Well,
We have to have something besides 30 and 40-year-old politicians in the Congress running everything.
This is a debate we've been having for a long time, and when I mean a long time, it goes back to the founding of our nation. Here's where I'm caught up in it. I don't disagree with your premise there, but before we have term limits on the people that you select to represent you for this monstrosity government, we need to have term limits on bureaucrats first that are appointed and not accountable to the people. Because here's right. The average conservative Republican stays in Congress about 12 years, and they've had enough, and they get frustrated and go home. Here's the problem that you read. Now, Thomas Jefferson was an advocate, strong advocate for what he called frequent rotation. John Adams took the other approach. John Adams says, I don't want the government telling the people who they can and cannot vote for. That's more government control. If you put a term limit on who the people can elect, that's the government saying, I don't care how good or bad that person is, you're not smart enough to determine whether or not they're going to represent you or not. That's the argument that's being made regarding term limits. Arkansas passed pretty draconian term limits on some of their elected officials. And I'm not advocating one way or the other, except for if we're going to have term limits on the people that the people select to go represent them, then you better have term limits on the people that are appointed that you cannot get rid of, because they're there for life. And short term limits would actually further empower them. That's what happened in Arkansas. They did an 8-year term limit on state house and state senate. It resulted in the youngest Speaker of the House in American history being elected to the Arkansas State House because he was the only one left. He had 6 years. Everybody else got booted out. Now, what happened, the negative side of that was, when I was in state legislature in Georgia, it took me about 7 or 8 years to actually understand the complexity of the entire government. And my job is oversight. I mean, part of my job is to oversee the government on behalf of the people. It took me that long just to really get a handle on the small part that I was supposed to get a handle. I'm still trying to get a handle on this monstrosity government we have in Washington, D.C. So if you limit someone, let's say in the House to 6 years or 8 years, a lot of times they're just now finding the skeletons in the closet at that point. I mean, look at Trey Gowdy. Trey Gowdy's done a tremendous job. Now, he's leaving of his own accord, but he's just really getting to that point where he's doing a phenomenal job in oversight and government reform. What happens is if you take those folks that are just getting to that point, and now you tell them they have to leave, the bureaucrats become more empowered. Now, that's just the reality of where we are in America. So the true solution is, if we do want to get to term limits, and I understand what you're saying, because when my wife and I were dating in Alaska, doing that church bus ministry, I turned 18 years old, and we got to go vote for the first time. And the first time I voted for a gentleman by the name of Don Young, was running for his 3rd re-election in Congress. Don Young's a colleague of mine now. He still serves. He's the longest serving member in the House. And so, yeah, there's some folks that have been there a long time, but the majority of those in the House rotate out, probably, at least on the Republican side, about 12 to 14 years. Some stay 1 term and they've had enough and go. So I do think we have to have that conversation. But before we have that conversation, we have to have serious government reform go into place, or the things that are frustrating us now are just going to become more frustrating, because there's still a lot of young blood in Congress that believes in that oversight and reform, and some are still very motivated, and it really, unfortunately, it takes about probably 8-10 years to get to that point where you can really be effective. We need to change that, and the only way you're going to change that is really reduce the scope and size of government. So.
Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm going to introduce Michael Hunnicky. He's going to come in. He's going to close us out. Representative Loudermilk is going to stick around for a few minutes after the meeting's over. But thank you all so much for coming out.